We have arrived at the present day, and we've already heard some of the challenges that are involved in that. Vince, go ahead and kick us off.
I think we are aware, as I mentioned earlier, that we are in a time of some division. And of course, you can't think about equipping pastors, equipping spiritual leaders in a way where you avoid the fact that you need to help them to navigate political tensions. We've all been hearing things about pastors, some checking out of pastoral ministry because the political tensions have been too much for them. Or in some cases, some would say they've been run out because they've dared to say something about political tension. So it's really important that our preparation of pastors includes giving them wisdom to how to negotiate these challenges of division.
Right, we're hearing that more and more from our alumni. And we know that it's an incredibly intimidating task to face a world in which if we send our students out there without being able to navigate these tensions, we're setting them up for major problems. Believe me, Vince and I are both professionally specialized in understanding politics. Vince and I have both been doing theology of politics for a long time, and we're baffled by what's going on right now. So if we're baffled, you don't have to feel bad if you feel baffled by it. It's an incredibly challenging, intense time that we're living in. These are not historically unique circumstances. There have been periods of intense pressure in the past, but they are at least unique in our recent experience. And we're having to relearn, how does the church navigate a time of such extreme polarization?
Indeed. And thankfully, we do have some help with this equipping today. So from two different locations, so from DC and from San Antonio, where a certain van is going soon, we have a couple of guests. So from DC, we have David French is with us. So author of Divided We Fall, senior editor of the Dispatch, and formerly of the National Review. And also we have Michael Weir with us, author of Reclaiming Hope, co-founder of the AND campaign, and who was part of Barack Obama's staff in the White House in the Office of Faith Outreach. So it is great to have both of them with us. So I'm going to ask them a few questions, and then you do Slido. Remember, KF21, in case you've forgotten. You will have your opportunity to ask questions of them. So this is a great opportunity for us. So Michael and David, welcome.
Well, thanks so much. And one quick fact check. I am in Tennessee. I stay as far away.
So nobody is in DC.
No, I stay as far away from DC on a routine basis as I can.
Well, now, just for a full disclosure, I grew up in Prince George's County, Maryland, not too far from DC. There's niceness in the DMV, as they call it. Though nobody called it the DMV when I was growing up. So I don't know when the DMV acronym showed up, but there we are. Well, guys, I'm so glad you're able to be with us. And I'm going to ask a few questions before I then get the audience in on this. So David, we'll start with you, and then Michael, you can answer this as well. How would each of you describe what is happening in politics right now that is constructive and encouraging? In other words, where do you see things going right? Where there's an upward trending arrow, if you will, even if that upward is like 5 degrees.
I'll start with the idea that there is a hunger for reason. There's a hunger for something different than the hyper polarized sort of the catastrophism of lots of modern political discourse. Everywhere I go, I find people who say, who can I read that's reasonable? What can I watch that's reasonable? So there is, and this is actually a group of Americans that has been studied and identified in some pretty rigorous research, and that is, they're called the exhausted majority. And these are the Americans. They're on the right, they're on the left, they're on the middle. So it's not just the moderates who believe we can do better and think that the way politics is moving is too toxic, it's too angry, it's too rage-filled. And so there is a critical mass of Americans who want something better. And since you said the good news, I won't really harp on the bad news, that the really operative word in the phrase exhausted majority is exhausted and not majority.
Right.
So we'll just leave that. We'll leave that for later.
One question about the exhaustive majority before we get to Michael, and that is there something that the exhaustive majority agrees upon? In other words, if you got them in a room together, what is there something that they agree upon, even though they are a mixed group of people?
Yeah, there are a few things that the exhausted majority agrees upon. One is that essentially that this is the times are just too toxic. They're fed up. So there's four things that the research shows, and I'm cribbing from this really indispensable hidden tribe study of American polarization from a group called More in Common. One, they're fed up with polarization. Number two, they're forgotten. They feel forgotten. They're overlooked because people aren't hearing their voices. Number three, they're while they might be left, middle, or right, they're kind of flexible in their views, and they'll endorse different policies according to a precise situation, rather than sticking ideologically to a single sort of whole. And they also believe we can find common ground. So those are people on the left and the middle and the right, and they share those four characteristics.
Oh, great. Thank you. Michael.
Yeah. Well, first, it's really a pleasure to be with you all, to be with David, to be with you, Vince, but then to have the opportunity to speak to all of you and have a conversation with all of you in the audience. I think, so I do think that there are good and bad sides to what David outlined. What I'll throw into the mix is that we are in a period of civic interest, and I think we're seeing an upswing in Americans who believe that they have a responsibility to the public, to our civic life. Now, the direction in which that is the way in which those affections and that energy is directed will determine just how good it is. But a commitment to and a recognition of the fact that our politics matter, that political decisions and our political culture affect us, and that we have a duty to be involved. That's on the upswing, and I think that there's a lot of positive local civic engagement that I see that we can build on. But with all of these sort of positive trends, there are dark sides, and maybe we'll even talk about some of the brighter sides of some of what we perceive to be dark trends. There is, I was about to go negative, but I think we'll have time for that. So I'll end there.
Okay. All right. Thanks. So second question, what do you see as, and maybe this is some of the dark side part, Michael, so we'll start with you in this one. What do you see as the major reasons politics is facing such tough problems right now?
Yeah, well, so we could talk about structural finance, campaign finance reform, the way our elections work. We could talk about that all day, but and we should. Those things are important. The real hard truth that we need to come to terms with is that the state of our politics is in some fundamental way a reflection of the state of our souls. That our politics is a reflection of who we are. And if we can't come to terms with that, then all the ways in which we might try and seek and address sort of systemic reforms will fall way short. We are going to politics generally as a people. We are going to politics as a forum for self-expression and self-aggrandizement. Politics has become a sort of reservoir for all of our hatreds and loves and aspirations and animosities. And politics is not meant to bear that weight. It can't bear that weight. And what happens is when we when we go to politics for those reasons, it actually crowds out our ability to go to politics for its limited purposes of affirming human dignity, advancing justice. And that's what we see right now. We see a political culture that is saturating not just sort of the political system proper, but as we see in our churches, in our communities, increasingly the toxic political culture that we have, a culture that is based on what social scientists at the end of 2020 wrote a really brief essay I would encourage folks to read. It's succinct, really. They describe the particular kind of political polarization we have today as political sectarianism. And really, they describe three pillars that hold up this political sectarianism. Othering, the othering of people not like you, aversion and aversion towards others, and then what they call moralism, and I call a misplaced moralism. I have no problem with moralism. It just better be in the right place. And what they identify as a really misplaced moralism. The good news, of course, is that Christianity offers tremendous resources to push back on misplaced moralism, on aversion and othering. One of the problems I see is a lack of confidence among Christians that Christian resources, that the way of Jesus actually holds up in public life, that Jesus is competent in public things, not just our personal finances and the way we treat our spouses and that kind of thing. And unless we understand, as you've led the way so well on, Vince, that political discipleship in a context like ours, where as citizens we are all political, not by choice, but by the fact that we're citizens. Political discipleship is central to discipleship. Right. End sentence, period. Right. And so hopefully we'll talk about that.
So can you give us where to find that article?
Yeah, if you search political sectarianism, okay. It was, it's been published in a number of places, but Stanford has probably the easiest. So if you just search political sectarianism, and you'll be able to find it pretty easily.
All right, thanks a lot, David.
I think that this concept of political sectarianism is really it's a vital concept, because what we're learning for an awful lot of people is that when push comes to shove, politics is the religion, and religion is the hobby. And so what we're beginning to see, and we're often finding in this in the most kind of direct way possible, which is you're suddenly realizing that maybe even your friendships, maybe even memberships in church, are contingent more upon political affiliation than on theology or adherence to small o orthodoxy. And so that's a real rubber meets the road kind of position. One of the things, when I think of one of the sort of the best C.S. Lewis quotes, and it's sort of hard to choose from them all. One is that courage is the form of every virtue at its testing point. And I've kind of extrapolated out from that is, we don't really know who we really are until things are tested. If everyone in your church, or all in your circle at church, believes both Jesus is Lord and person X should be president, we don't know which of those two beliefs really is the thing that unifies us until that's tested. And what we began to see, I think, a lot in the church is that a lot of the things that we thought were sort of consensus ideas, and it wasn't just about politics. It could be something about masks. It could be about police violence. It could be about race. It could be about, you name it. As soon as some of those underlying points of agreement began to fracture, the superstructure itself began to fracture, because those underlying points of agreement were actually more vital to us than some of the things that we would intellectually say were the most important. It turned out that emotionally they were not, and that emotionally what we thought was less important was actually much greater importance to us. Because if you put even, say, a Christian nationalist patriot church pastor under a polygraph, they would say Jesus is more important than America. and they'd pass the polygraph, right? But one of the elements of Christian nationalism isn't so much a set of theological beliefs as much as it is an emotional, visceral commitment. And I think that's a formulation that Thomas Kidd used, which I think is incredibly helpful, not just in discerning, say, the Christian nationalist kind of mindset, but any sort of political mindset that begins to trump our abstract, sort of intellectually possessed theology. It's where are you here in your heart that ultimately dictates where you ultimately go here in your head.
So just one quick follow-up to that, because I've heard a lot of people talk about that dimension. And one of the things I wonder is, let's just talk about, in at least a good sense, sort of, that word evangelical. And what I mean is this: if you ask, quote unquote, the garden variety evangelical, what do you trust the most for your authority, right? Then, is the triune God and the Bible.
Right.
What is it that, and when they say that, they're probably thinking that, and that includes that emotional commitment.
Right.
Where's the disconnect with what they're saying and the fact that actually, again, at the testing shows that, well, your emotional commitment seems to be more to certain other things, and it's at least a parallel commitment to purportedly the Bible and God, or maybe even it's above that.
I think the asking is irrelevant at this point. I think the asking is irrelevant. What is relevant are ultimately what flows out of us, at times of testing. That's what's really relevant. Now, maybe I'm overstating to say it's irrelevant. If you articulate a commitment to an idea, sometimes that does have some sort of hold on you that I feel like I need to follow through on the things that I've said, although recent history is littered with examples of people finding very clever ways to kind of wriggle out of some very clear statements from the past. And so even that, it doesn't have that much of a hold. I served in Iraq during the surge, and there's this movie cliche of sort of the barracks warrior, that when the bullets start flying, that they're nowhere to be seen, and somehow, maybe the more quiet person rises to the occasion. Well, I saw that's a real phenomenon. That's a real phenomenon. There are people who envision themselves one way, and that when it really gets tough, turn out to be something else entirely. And for me, having seen that in war zones, for example, having seen that in the way people approach politics, it's profoundly humbling. It's very humbling. You start to think, how do I envision myself and how am I really? And it really, I think it makes you want to go to the foot of the cross and say, Lord, give me the strength. Give me the strength, because what I think about myself might not be myself when the chips are down.
Yeah.
Helpful.
Go ahead. Yeah, let me add a couple of things. So two pieces. One, Dallas Willard wrote in the late 90s that evangelical theology has developed in such a way that you could be the worst kind of person possible, but so long as you provide mental assent to the right ideas, you'll end up in the good place and not the bad place. And I think there was some really keen insight that Willard had. He referred to what he called barcode faith. The idea that so long as you had the right label, it didn't matter what was in the package. The scanner, the sort of divine scanner would see that you have the right barcode on, and you'd be in. And that's what the Christian life is about getting to the good place. And so everything else is sort of debatable and negotiable. The second thing, I think we've I think that it's become. I want to say this.
You don't have to be diplomatic.
Yeah. So I think that we've. It's interesting the ways in which we've imbibed exactly the secular narratives that we say in our minds that we reject. John Kennedy is sort of put in front of the Houston Baptist Ministerial Alliance in one of the great ironies of history by evangelicals to say that he will not allow his faith to influence his politics whatsoever. And the ripple effects of that through history, both for Catholics and the message that sent about, well, when the rubber really meets the road, it's other resources we must draw on, because religious resources are for the personal and the moral, and we need to rely on other sets of knowledge for the really practical work of politics. We have not come to terms with the extent to which that dominates the evangelical mind, the ways in which the evangelical mind has become secularized and in some unhelpful ways.
Right. Interesting observation about that is that, I mean, it really is the bifurcation of theology and ethics, right? I mean, you have an ad hoc relationship between what you confess, and then you kind of make it up as you go along with the way you're actually living and draw on those other resources. So it is this interesting, unfortunate irony. Next question. You've proven that it's possible, both of you have proven it's possible to participate in politics without losing Christian integrity. What's made that possible for you? Are there principles or practices you want to commend? Yeah. I'm looking at you, Michael, you can start.
Yeah, sure. So a few things. First, being grounded in a local church, and being grounded in Christian community that is not a political, that is not a community that is synonymous with your political community. I mean, it's really important to be going to a church with folks that have different approaches to politics, but you're worshiping the same God. The disciplines of solitude and silence are really important to help us come to terms with and push back against the ways our media narratives and just the rut of thinking that we get into. We get carried along by streams that we don't even know we're in the water, and solitude and silence can help break that hold on us. I think the third thing is, our media and technological habits, the ways in which the sources of media we go to, our inability to unplug. Folks don't understand the sophistication of political technology to reach into our psyches more than ever in a personalized way. And so if you aren't intentionally pushing back against that, then you will find that you're being shaped more and more by sources that you're not even consciously sort of understanding that they're feeding in. And then from my experience, actually, being in politics, it was really important for me to invite people who disagreed with me politically, that I trusted as brothers and sisters, to hold me accountable in terms of my public presence. And so, just a quick story: when I took a campaign role in 2012, I had seen the way these roles had played out in the past. And when you're doing faith outreach for a candidate, the easiest thing to do, the most direct line to getting support for that candidate, is to say, if you are a real Christian, you will vote for my candidate. Or the Christian thing, my candidate is the Christian candidate. And I was really dead set against falling into that trap. And so right when I got the role, I asked 6 Republican friends of mine to hop on a conference call with me every week. And I said, I'm not responsible for everything that comes out of this campaign, but for things that come out of my shop, I want you to hold me accountable, that my job is to make the best case that I can for the candidate I'm working for. That's like everyone understands that that's my role. But I want you to hold me accountable for not what C.S. Lewis said C.S. Lewis has this essay, Meditations on the Third Commandment, and he says, really the greatest temptation when we combine faith and politics is to proclaim God hath said when he hasn't spoken, to say this is God's position on a prudential issue when God has not spoken that clearly. And so when it comes to politics, when it comes to campaigns, wanting to be really careful to offer space for difference, for different faithful approaches to an issue or an election. I'll just quickly add, I've been very clear, and people have been very upset with me for insisting, even weeks out in a national op-ed before the election, for saying that I don't believe that supporting Trump was a sin or a lack of faithfulness, that a vote for Trump was inherently, but that's where our politics goes. It's not you're voting for the wrong guy. It's not I disagree with your approach here. The easiest way is you have betrayed God if you vote for a different candidate than I did, and it's just it is more complicated than that, and it has to be more complicated than that in how we communicate.
David?
I'd just completely echo what Michael said about grounding yourself in a local church, accountability with people and with friends and pastors who are not deeply involved in politics, being able to have that check on yourself that's outside the bubble. I think that political bubble and that political sort of hothouse environment is really, really, really important. Being deeply connected in a local church is very, very important. And I've seen too many people who get very focused on politics. It's almost as if they become kind of a rootless person in a way. They're traveling so much, they're going in so many different directions, attending so many different conferences that they're not really rooted anywhere. And I think that gets very, very dangerous. And then I think in the online world, if you are somebody who's really interested in these topics, and I'm not even going to presume that everybody in the audience is really interested in these topics, but if you are somebody who's really interested in politics, I have a couple of rules of thumb that I apply that really help me a lot. One is, to the extent that I'm on social media, unfortunately, I'm on social media to a great extent, but when I'm on social media, I try to follow about roughly equal numbers of people in different political camps so that I'm getting a good sense of where thoughtful people are across the spectrum. So I'm trying hard to break the bubble. Number two is that I will always try to read new ideas or new thoughts from the proponents of the ideas and not the opponent of the idea. So for example, just to take a hot button issue that's burning, it's not new, but it's new to a lot of people, CRT. A lot of people sort of have pre-existing go-to commentators that they really like if they're on the left or on the right. So they'll hear of a new thing and they'll say, oh, I wonder what National Review says about CRT. Totally worth reading National Review on CRT. But if the first you're hearing of CRT is, I'm going to say, go to somebody who advocates CRT and read that first, then read the critique. It's a great way of sort of getting the best expression of the view before you learn the criticism of the view, because very few criticisms are completely fair in casting what a belief system is. And then, the other thing that I would say is, you absolutely, and this is especially true for pastors, less so for, say, somebody like me who is a legal commentator in addition to sort of talking about religion and culture. You don't have to feel like you have to know everything about everything. A pastor does not, as much as a congregation might be pushing a pastor in this direction, you don't have to know everything about mRNA vaccines. You don't have to know everything about qualified immunity and police brutality. You don't have to know everything about everything. That you can't do it in addition to pastoring a church, in addition to being there for the sick and being there for people who are going through a crisis in their marriage and their business. But what are pastors good at? Well, they're good at heart formation. How is it that we approach these questions? And we so skip over that so much. We go straight to the answer. What's the answer on mRNA vaccines? How safe are they? Pastor. What? I mean, I couldn't imagine being a pastor and all of a sudden having to become an expert in epidemiology and masks becoming an expert in mRNA vaccines, becoming an expert in election law in 50 states, and becoming an expert in police reform, all in 9 months, while I am shepherding a flock that is going through health challenges, economic challenges. We had record drug overdoses. And I would say liberate yourself from the sense that you have to have the answer to all of the outcomes. That what you're good at and what is your training and what you're so good at is at your best is what is the condition of my heart as I approach these incredibly difficult concepts, imbibing, what does it mean to not have a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of sound mind? What does it mean to approach politics where we're to act justly? Yes, but also to love mercy and to walk humbly. To me, that's wheelhouse pastoral stuff. Whereas I'm much less interested in sort of where you come down on, this or that policy reform idea, or even this or that candidate.
Great. So
tremendously,
go ahead, Michael.
It's tremendously important what David just shared. I think a lot of pastors are getting these emails saying, you have a moral responsibility to speak out. One of my favorite cases of this, or I think one of the ones that really showed me how pervasive and destructive this had been is during the healthcare debates during the Trump administration. I remember seeing a Christian say, if your pastor does not preach on the motion to proceed vote to overcome, you need to leave that church. And I thought, first of all, who knows what a motion to proceed vote is? Second of all, the whole point is if the motion to proceed vote passes, they need to actually vote on the thing. So now we're talking about pastors needing to teach entire series on healthcare reform in order to meet this person's standards. And what I try and remind pastors is it is very rare that you are being asked to speak about a policy issue by someone who is just so eager to hear and follow what you have to say. The more likely situation is that you are being asked to make a pronouncement from the pulpit, typically, on an issue so that that person can tell Bob on the other end of the pew who they've been fighting about the issue. Well, now pastor has spoken, so you better get in line. Mm-hmm. And so I would really I think what David shared about sort of the prudentiality of politics, making sure you're guarding the. It can get very confusing for congregations if they're hearing their pastor pronounce prudential political judgments from the same pulpit from which they read the gospel. Mm-hmm. And one of two things can happen. They can start to take the pastor's political pronouncements as seriously as they take their reading of the gospel, or they could say, well, I don't agree with the pastor's political views, so maybe he's just as wrong about the gospel. So it's very important to not be swept up in sort of some of this church activism that's happening.
Yeah, and one thing, and that just to piggyback on that, so there are certain areas where I'm by no means expert in everything, but there are certain areas that I concentrate my work on and have concentrated my education. And every now and then I'll see a pastor, whether it's a pastor online or a pastor somewhere, start to opine authoritatively in areas where I have a lot of granular knowledge. And often it's like, no, stop, please stop, no. You're not, even if you might be directionally in what I would consider to be going in the right direction, often there's so much nuance and so, many complexities that this sort of policy authoritativeness becomes discrediting. This purported policy authoritativeness becomes discrediting. And just to really emphasize what Michael said, and anytime you say something, and I'm keenly aware of this, anytime you say something where someone who's listening, who's an expert in the arena, says, "You're off base there, dude. you realize you've just undermined everything you do. And that's one reason why I will, I do a legal podcast, for example, and we talk about a lot of different things. And I will preface what I'm saying by saying this: I'm not an antitrust lawyer, so I'm really looking forward to antitrust lawyers filling in the gaps here. But here are some general principles, and so even leading with humility in that regard can be incredibly important. But be very careful about a policy authoritativeness just be careful.
Great. So now the audience has questions for you, all of which we definitely will not get to. So I'll pick some. Please don't be offended if yours isn't chosen. So first, how do we get evangelicals to stop fearing the boogeyman of Marxism in politics/society and recover social justice as a Christian call, not a political tool?
Well, I'll say one thing is social justice is important. I think we need to make sure that we're taking our cues, though, not from whatever the presiding authorities happen to be saying right now are the sort of leading causes of social justice. It's one of my concerns with, I think, a political outlook that seems to originate and be completely shaped and defined by the last 5-6 years of our politics, which is that, if you extend your outlook a bit, you'll see the great sort of that some of the leading voices for social justice now are saying things about criminal justice reform, for instance, that is the exact opposite of what they were saying 20 years ago. But the moral language has not, the moral certitude has not changed. The policies have completely flipped, but the moral certitude has not changed. And so, I think it's, look, there is a significant percentage of the population that is just in an absolute sewer of a media environment, that is in a really predatory activist environment in which potentially only the gospel can help shift what is self-centered to what is other-centered. But I also want to make sure that we are not imposing on people who are trying to navigate the world as we are, a prescribed sort of vision of what social justice looks like that is not necessarily synonymous with faithfulness or a biblical worldview or anything like that. And so I know it's very frustrating for Pat. Anytime you mention racial injustice, it's becoming a cultural Marxist, and that's something I don't think you could bend to. I think you need to be clear about where Scripture sits, again, not on particular policy instruments, but as David said, the orientation of the heart. But also we need to be careful not to impose the latest dogma and ask everyone else to follow it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think that one of the things that is important in this, so number one, let's just acknowledge that there is absolutely no way to navigate, for example, race issues without somebody getting supremely ticked off. So the measure of your success is not, did everyone agree with me? So some people are going to get supremely ticked off, even if you just raise it. I mean, where I am in Middle Tennessee, there are people who are trying to ban from our early elementary curriculum the book Ruby Bridges Goes to School. Okay. They're trying to, and one of the offensive, another one about Dr. King Goes to Washington. The Norman Rockwell painting of Ruby Bridges desegregating schools in New Orleans. So that is not a position where you're going to say, well, in order to accommodate somebody who's upset at a historically accurate depiction of desegregation, I'm going to remain quiet. No. However, at the same time, there is also we should go out of our way to try to use language and concepts that are not explicitly tribal, jargony, and often highly political. Okay, so there are different ways of describing things. So in more left-leaning circles, you might say systemic injustice or systemic racism, and people will know what you mean, and it's not going to be super controversial. You might go into another audience, and the word systemic racism might immediately mean that they don't, or the phrase systemic racism might immediately mean they tune you out completely. And so I still want to communicate with folks, and I still want to reach their hearts on this. So one of the ways that I try to do it, I say, there was 345 years of racism of slavery followed by Jim Crow, which is legally enforced discrimination violently defended for 345 years. You do not eliminate all of the effects of that in 57 years of contentious change after the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Do you agree? And if somebody says yes to that, now we're cooking. Now we're cooking. If somebody says no, that of course you eliminate the effects of 345 years in 57 years of contentious change, well, you got to back up some steps there. But if they're going to agree that you don't eliminate those consequences in those 57 years, you got something to work with. And then the other thing is, don't go for everything when you can go for one thing or two things. And this is one of the things that is just so much a part of our online discourse, which is, if you're not my 100%, if you're only my 80% friend, you're turned into a 100% enemy. So, in a race issue, you could talk about, oh yeah, we absolutely need qualified immunity reform. We need a ban on no-knock raids. We need this. We need greater funding for inner city schools. And then they say, and we need to get rid of gifted and talented programs. You go, whoa. Well, then all of a sudden you're a bad person. No, dive into the areas of agreement. Dive into those. And I think that, because one of the things that ends up happening, ironically enough, is that if you treat somebody as a pariah when they don't agree on everything, nothing happens. Nothing happens except you feel awesome about yourself and terrible about the other person. So find the point of agreement, dive into the point of agreement, and also understand that there are some folks for whom even bringing up the topic is too much. But that doesn't mean, because your goal isn't universal consensus, that doesn't mean that you don't bring up the topic. You have to bring it up. You have to. But there are ways in which you can do it that I think can build consensus rather than divide.
Great. A follow-up to something you said, Michael. Can you paint a picture of how the way of Jesus is truly competent in public life? What are a few specific competencies that we can bring?
It's a wonderful question. I've been, for the last 6-7 years, I've been asking audiences at my events. Dallas Willard had a definition of joy. He defined joy as a pervasive and constant sense of well-being. And I'd ask audiences, how many of you would define our politics as being full of a pervasive and constant sense of well-being? And of course, it's a laugh line. Now, how many of you would say that the posture that you bring to politics is full of a pervasive and constant sense of well-being? Well, joy is a competency. If the world is truly a safe place in which to follow Jesus, then that has political implications in our posture for the kinds of the policies and the form of our activism, what we're willing to do and what we're not willing to do. It affects how we take a loss and how we pursue a win. Hope is much the same way. Forgiveness, mercy. These are all resources that we have to bring to the public. I don't mean to bring up a partisan figure, but after Charleston, after the shooting in Charleston, I'm convinced that Barack Obama made the boldest theological proclamation of any American president in recent memory, which is that he walked into a church that had just been devastated by the murder of 9 of its folks, 9 of its members, including its pastor. And he said, this might be an opportunity. This might be an opportunity for God's grace. That imagine President Bush in the wake of Hurricane Katrina saying that this might be an opportunity for God's grace. I mean, the boldness to step into that environment and say there are possibilities with God, even in the darkest of moments, to make the next appropriate step is profound. And that is the kind of opportunity and possibility that Christians can bring to our neighbors in what seems today like a very dark and entrenched time in our political life. The last thing, we've already touched on it, but Jamie Smith, the philosopher, the Christian philosopher out of Calvin, he talks about 2 things. He talks about what he says Christian political participation should be accompanied by a tinge of ambivalence. And I just think that is precisely right. And he wrote this in his book about political theology. So Jamie Smith is no quietist, but a tinge of ambivalence. Then the second thing he says is that we need to de-escalate our politics, not to make it unimportant, but to make it penultimate. The problem with our politics is not that people take it too seriously. The problem is that we take it seriously in all of the wrong ways. So all of these things, we could go on. I mean, inexhaustible resources the Christian faith has to offer, practical, historical, intellectual, institutional, and we need to think as spokespeople for Christ about what it means to offer these things as resources to the public.
Great, David. So this will be the last question because we unfortunately have 3 minutes. We could keep going on forever. This is amazing. If you were to break up and rename the evangelical voting bloc, how would you do it?
The voting bloc.
That's what the question said. Yes.
So that raises a really interesting point. I mean, the voting bloc the white evangelical voting bloc is a God and country voting bloc. I mean, that's what it is, because what we have to discern is we've got 2, when we use the word evangelical, you have to understand you have an exit poll definition and you have a theological definition. Right. So the exit poll definition just works like this. They ask your ethnicity. If you say you're white, then they ask, are you evangelical or born again? If they say, yeah, if you say yes, then you're an evangelical. Okay. Now, it also happens to be that 2/3 of white Republicans who go to church once a year or less identify as evangelical. All right, so I'm not an expert in all brands of evangelical theology, but I know that it's a very small group that is the never go to church branch of evangelical theology. And so what's going on here is that for a lot of people who identify as Christian and identify as Republican, that equals evangelical. Whether they go to church or they don't go to church, whether they're biblically literate or whether they're not biblically literate. And this is sort of the God and country conservatism. A lot of people say, oh, that's the pro-life group. No, it actually turns out that they tend to be more motivated by immigration issues than life issues, for example. So that's one set of Americans. And it's, 27, 26, 28% of Americans who are self-identified white evangelicals. And that is by and large a God and country GOP movement. As Ryan Burge, statistician from Eastern Illinois, said, white evangelicals are Republicans, Republicans are white evangelicals. But then there's another group, and these are the theological evangelicals. These are the people that would answer yes to the Barna test or follow the Bebington quadrilateral. That's a lot smaller group of people. That might be 6-7% of America of all races and ethnicities. And that's a much more politically diverse community. And so we get these 2 groups mixed together all the time. And so when you're talking about self-described exit poll evangelicals, that is 80+%, and that's a disproportionate 80+% GOP and disproportionately sort of God and country theology / politics. The Theological evangelical, the 6 or 7%, many of them are quite Republican for sure, but it's much more much more politically mixed. And their politics flows from a bit of a different place. And so that's one of the really confusing things about our present moment. A lot of pastors who are tweeting a lot about politics, like they know a ton about evangelicals, their whole experience is with the theological evangelical. They have no experience with the non-church going evangelical. And that non-church going evangelical actually has the critical mass of political power in this coalition. And I don't think people truly understand that. Doesn't mean that we don't try to deal with stuff in our churches, but it just shows you the immensity of sort of the challenge of even defining what an evangelical is in this context.
Great. I wish we could talk more, but the clock has ended and the last sand has gone through the hourglass. So join me in thanking David and Michael. Thanks so much for being with us. We really appreciate it. And now I will hand you back to Greg Forrester. Thanks, guys. Great to see you.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. You know, it's such an honor to have them with us, two people who operate at the highest levels of political discourse and practice, but who have really sacrificed to protect their Christian integrity. We're just amazed. I'm amazed to have them join us. And notice when asked, what has made it possible for you to participate in these extremely intense political activities and keep your integrity? Both of them immediately and emphatically said, I'm in a local church that does a good job of grounding me. For those of us who train pastors, that might be a connection worth exploring with our students.